This is Miller Philosopher, and consider this part 2 from my previous video on Denethor's relationship with his sons. That video had made me wonder, had me jump down the rabbit hole yet again, that what would have happened had Denethor not deleted himself during the War of the Ring and had survived long enough to meet Aragorn once again. And based on my earlier thoughts, I think it would have been far more tense than just your basic political power struggle. At the end of the siege of Minas Tirith, Aragorn still refuses to step foot into the city, but I do believe Denethor, being the official ruler of Gondor still, would have come out to the war council with Éomer, Gandalf, and Prince Amrahill of Dol Amroth. And the tension would be thick, not just because of the competing titles for the rulership of Gondor, but that the two men hadn't seen each other in decades, and the last time they had saw each other, that there was unresolved beef between them, at least on Denethor's part. Presumably, Denethor would have recovered somewhat, and while being relieved at Faramir's survival, still seeing the man who had cost him so much now standing across from him victorious would be bitter beyond words for such a prideful and powerful man, at least formally. I can picture Aragorn greeting him as an old comrade and someone whom he actually respected, having fought, presumably, alongside him during the war with Umbar. But Denethor's disdain, insecurity, and anger would be palpable to everybody. Fresh from a mental crash out after all, his ability to mask his feelings would be weak. And looking at Aragorn, whom still being unchanged and still carrying that aura of the Númenórean kings, while Denethor himself had aged, would be a brutal reminder of how much stronger the bloodline of Númenor ran in the House of Elendil rather than the House of Mardil. So Denethor's pride would suffer Aragorn the glory of the victory, again, but also demanded submission. As High Steward of Gondor, he would insist that Aragorn be honored only as a High Lord of Gondor from an ancient lineage that they both shared. And therein lies the problem. Aragorn long believed and had been groomed that the right to rule the Dunedain, all of them, was his and his alone. He was the last living heir of Elendil after all. Gandalf, being blunt as ever, would verbally remind Denethor of this, and Prince Amrahill would back him up on that. Éomer, though Aragorn's friend, would probably stay out of it because clearly this was an internal Gondorian squabble, and Rohan probably didn't want any of that shit. Denethor would counter with the precedent of his ancestors, since Steward Mardil long centuries past, that Gondor acknowledges the kinship with Arnor, but never accepted claimants to the line of kings outside of the line of Anarion, Gondor's first king. Now, given the war and wartime pragmatism, Aragorn, probably annoyed as he at Denethor's stubbornness, which he wouldn't understand quite why, though there was clearly something going on, would see that this was not the time to settle ancient disputes, whether that be between the Dunedain or himself and Denethor. So, canon events would continue as is, with Aragorn leaving Denethor in charge of the city while he continues on to the Black Gate. Now, it's after the war that things will come to a head. The final defeat of Sauron and the finding and blossoming of the White Tree would all be signs to Denethor that the time of the stewards was over, and that he could no longer hide from that. Moreover, word would spread that a man of the ancient line of kings had returned from the shadows and saved Gondor, not just among the people, however, but also and most importantly among the army as well. After all, if you're going to resist the claimant to a throne or some sort of rulership, you're going to want the armies back. And if Gondor had a religion, it was that the hope that the line of kings would one day be restored, because officially at least, the last Gondorian king, Eärnur, was never acknowledged as being dead, though everyone pretty much knew that he was. So go figure. So therefore, Denethor would basically find himself in the same position that he found himself in during and after the Umbar War, only worse. The hero of the war, who had just left Gondor beforehand, was now intent on returning and claiming the throne. And Denethor, being tired and without support, would have no choice but to yield the scepter to Aragorn and submit the stewards back under the rule of Elendil's line. So the question then becomes, what becomes of him then? I mean, at this point, Denethor would be utterly defeated, not by Sauron, the Easterlings, the Corsairs, or the Haradrim, but by the same rival that nearly supplanted him in his youth. Once again, Aragorn had swept in and taken everything away that Denethor had held dear, except Faramir. And this leads to two particular paths that I see him taking. On the one hand, Denethor would basically recede into the shadows, unable to cope with this final coup de grace of his failure as a ruler, a father, and the gatekeeper of Gondor's traditions. He would basically just recede into the background, die in isolation and personal disgrace, even though Aragorn would still honor him at his funeral as a hero of Gondor and a worthy protector of what it had stood for. But on the other hand, Denethor could be reconciled to Faramir, having learned his hard lesson, and through that, perhaps, even be reconciled to Aragorn, who again never truly knew the depth of Denethor's resentment towards him. Just that this guy had beef with him and was always projecting it at him, but never knowing why or saying why. But assuming that Denethor puts that beef to rest, Denethor would decide to retire from the stewardship willingly, pass it to Faramir, and then goes to live with him and Eowyn in Ithilien. And quite honestly, that's probably a much better end that the man deserves, but even still, it's a much kinder end all the same. But more or less, that's kind of what I see happening if Denethor and Aragorn had re-met again during the War of the Ring. Let me know your own thoughts below, or I hope you enjoyed the video. This is Middle Philosopher. Have a good day.